Francesco, can you hear me okay?
I can. And you can hear me okay? Chuck, can you hear me okay? Chuck, can you hear me okay now?
I can hear you now. Yes,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Good.
I'm going to put my mic on because I got a little background noise where I am. I don't
All
want
right.
it to
Sure thing.
interfere.
Sure thing.
But when we're going to kick off right at 6 o'clock?
I'll leave it to you to decide. It's 5:59 now, so we're quickly approaching.
Yeah, I'm ready to go if you are. We've got a lot of material here, and I
We
think
do.
the sooner we start, the better. Let's see, we've got we still got more people coming on board here, but so without further ado, I'm online here, and we'll be engaged together with you in directing this. But I think we've got 55 slides. It's an action-packed presentation. We've got 2 hours to squeeze it in, so let's kick it off.
Okay. Thanks, Chuck. I take it you're handing the floor to me.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for making time this evening, and thanks again for meeting twice this month. I know that with your regular meetings, it makes it a very busy month, but it's really helped us to keep this work on track. And our agenda this evening, as Chuck mentioned, we do have quite a bit to cover, but it's very straightforward. First, we'll review the work that we had been doing over the past 2 or 3 meetings, and that being the recommendations for commercial, mixed use, and industrial zoning districts. And then we'll get into our new subject matter, which for this evening will be a review of your parking regulations and a discussion about potential needs and potential amendments to those regulations. And then, as usual, we'll look ahead to our next steps in the process. And here we are towards the end of January. It's beginning work on the next phase of work, transitioning from the commercial, industrial, mixed-use work into site design, including a review of your buffer requirements, parking requirements, and sign regulations. And we'll focus on parking this evening. At our last meeting, we had reviewed some ideas, some potential amendments that we discussed, and we decided not to advance a couple of those ideas. The first one being expansion of the number of neighborhood development districts that are permitted. Your regulations only allow up to 5 zones to be created. These are floating zones, and you have a couple already. And as I understand from Clifton, there are applications that are expected, if not have been already received, for the creation of new zones. The current limit is 5. And I think the commission was strongly in favor of keeping that at that limit. So we will not advance that idea. Next was the recommendation for the creation of village districts in the town. That the creation of village district is nothing that would occur through our zoning work. It's a separate set of regulations. It's actually adopted by your legislative authority, not Planning and Zoning Commission. But we were in the position to make a recommendation that the town consider creation of such districts, potentially in Mystic, potentially Pawcatuck. And you decided to defer that, any discussion of that, to the upcoming POCD planning process, which I think works very well. It's very appropriate subject matter for the POCD, and the POCD can make similar recommendations. In fact, the creation of a village district is supposed to be supported by your plan of conservation and development, by recommendations of that plan. So I think that'll be a very good vehicle for exploring that idea. Okay, we did agree to advance several amendments that we had been discussing, refining, and adjusting over the course of a couple of meetings. And so we have several that are now in the packet that was sent to you. I'll walk through them one by one. I don't think we need to take a lot of time here because we reviewed these over the course of more than one meeting. I just want to confirm and review and confirm what we've included in the packet you received. So first would be the merger of the DB5 and the LS5 zones near Alpha Ave. And based upon our discussion, what we've done is we've recommended amending the boundaries of the existing LS5 district to remove it from both the Como and the town-owned properties so that those boundaries no longer split those parcels, and restrict it to 2 parcels that are commercial. And then go ahead and merge it with the existing DB5 in that area to create a new LS5 zone with new boundaries that incorporates the DB5. And so that we've amended the recommendation to that effect and updated the mapping and the information about the parcels to reflect that. Next is our recommendation to expand the range of permitted uses, basically allowing uses in zones where they are not currently allowed. And our recommendations are largely consistent with what you've seen before. We did add a contractor yard to that, which we had discussed at our last meeting as a new use permitted in zones. I realized that the commission had some concerns about microbreweries and their emissions from microbreweries. So we looked into that since our last meeting. The state, as we had discussed, the state does in fact regulate emissions. However, your zoning regulations restrict the size of any microbrewery to about 3,000 square feet, the production area. And so that's a very small footprint. So that a footprint that small is not expected to generate a significant amount of emissions, probably much less than many restaurants. So I don't know that there is an additional level of regulation needed on those businesses, such as distancing requirements or anything of that nature. And if you still feel strongly and have a concern about this, we're happy to hear that. I think at this point it'd be best just to submit comments to Clifton rather than discuss it this evening, because I'd like to reserve most of our time for discussion of your parking regulations. Everything else we had discussed and we were in agreement on, and it's all documented in the memorandum that was provided to you. Okay, I'll pause there in case anyone has any questions or comments with respect to this recommended amendment.
No questions. I'd keep on going. Thank you.
Okay, very well. Very well. All right. And Sal asked, is the memorandum online? No, it is not yet online. It has been distributed to all commissioners for their review. Once the commission and the town and Clifton is comfortable with posting it online, we will make it available online. And with that being said, they might beat me to it already, but it will be made available as prior documents have been made available. All right. Okay, the next started out as a fairly ambitious recommendation, and in fact, this is hardly a standalone amendment anymore. It could really be rolled into the one we just reviewed. It started out, we looked across all your districts at reducing special permit requirements, down to site plan requirements. And what we ended up coming up with was one use in one district, and that is laundromats in the PV5, reducing those from special use permit to a site plan. So that's what this recommendation describes, and there's not much more to it than that. Recommendation 31 is to regulate outdoor adult-oriented establishments. And based upon concerns and comments received, I went back and took a look at the HI 60 zone, did some basic measurements. Fortunately, is a fairly large zone, it's comprised of lots of parcels. And so we could be more robust in our distancing requirement without making it infeasible for a business to be established. So what we've done in this draft is we've increased the distancing between individual establishments from the 500 feet that we had to 1,000 feet. And we also increased the required distance from a residential zone from 200 feet to 500 feet. And I hope that it addresses the concerns that were raised. I know Lynn particularly had drawn attention to this and was concerned about it. Okay.
Francesco, this is Lynn.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Hi. We also talked about the signage associated with these establishments.
Yes.
Is that going to be in the next section and not part of this this page here of summary?
Yes. Thank you for reminding me of that discussion. We did explore this issue, and I thought it was best to defer that to our review of the sign regulations as a whole. I can tell you my take on that without getting too far into it is, first, your sign regs are fairly restrictive with respect to size of any given signage and amount of signage. It's already very restrictive. Second, I do have some concerns about discriminating against a particular type of business, regardless of the type of business, in having a parallel set of standards for that business. I think it could be challenged in the courts. Most of the court cases, most of the case law that I've seen, and I'm not a lawyer, of course, has surrounded content, regulating the messaging of signs. And I've yet to find a good case about requirements for a particular use based upon size of signage, location of signage, amount of signage, etc. So we need to look into that a little further. You could certainly adopt a regulation that is more strict with respect to signage. The real question is, could that be challenged successfully in court is what it comes down to.
Okay, so we'll talk about it more when we get to the signage part.
Absolutely. Yeah, because
Great.
we're going to go through your sign regs top to bottom. We have some work to do in those anyway to move them into a more content neutral direction.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for raising that. Outdoor vendors. So based upon our discussion, we've recommended removing outdoor vendors as a principal use. So essentially prohibiting them as a principal use and instead making them an accessory use in the same zones we're currently allowed, that being the GC 60 and TC 80. So we're not allowing in zones we're not currently allowed, and we're making an accessory use. And what that means is outdoor vending could only be operated on a lot that has a principal use, so not on a vacant lot. There may or may not be some outdoor vendors that are operating on lots that don't have a principal use, and those vendors would be grandfathered in, allowed to continue, but they'd be a non-conforming use and would not be allowed to expand in operation. Okay. Any questions or comments on this? We had our first discussion about how to handle this 2 weeks ago, and you've yet to see this recommendation, so I'm happy to receive any comments or questions on it.
So one of the key discussion, this is Lynn again, one of the key discussion points from last meeting, and one of the reasons we went to accessory use was also the fact that we could have it time bound. And I just want to make sure that that is correct. So we can now say, because it's listed as accessory use, that it can only be, I'm making it up, May 31st to June 30th or whatever. Correct?
Well, so you can do that even if it's a principal use. You can still restrict the use. We did talk about at our last meeting about the fact that the seasonality of this type of business was likely self-regulating in that someone's just not going to be doing much business in the winter, so they're not going to have incentive to do business. And I did review the regulations that you currently have in place for outdoor vending, and you do restrict the size, you have other requirements, and you limit the operating hours from dawn to dusk. So you have a pretty good set of regs in place that controls how this type of use can be conducted. And it may be worthwhile to revisit those, take a look at them and see if you see any deficiencies. I thought they were fairly complete. They require certification by Department of Health. They have a limit on the area that can be consumed. The requirements for, traffic flow and that sort of thing. Limits on displays. So it's a fairly good set of regulations. It provides some of the basic controls. There's certainly examples of far more robust regulations that you could definitely add more. I'm just not sure there are any notable deficiencies or issues surrounding this use in town that need to be addressed. And, one of the things I could do is reach out to the zoning enforcement officer to find out if there are any nuisance issues surrounding these types of uses that the regulations fail to control or provide guidance on, in which case we could try to plug some of those holes.
Yeah, I think my concern is a couple of things.
Yeah.
What we've seen in other areas, not necessarily Stonington, is that outdoor vendors, it's becoming more and more popular because it's a cheaper way to run a business. And so I think we have to be proactive. It's not necessarily what we've seen in the past. It's looking forward to say, okay, well, how could this happen in our town? So,
Yeah.
I think that's the attitude we have to have with this. Again, just because it's a new business model and it's very popular, especially in tourist towns, especially as restaurants get more and more crowded, especially as people, they're just coming in for a day, they want a quick this or a quick that. Tourists come in and it's for a particular fair or a particular celebration, whatever. So I do think that we have to look at this kind of with a different mindset.
Okay.
So I'll take a look, but that's kind of how I'm thinking this through. Let's put it that way.
Okay. And it's in section 5.3.20 that those outdoor regs are located. I did follow up with town planner's office regarding outdoor vending and how, because the question was raised about how this was licensed or permitted for festivals. And so the festivals are permitted through police department, and a function that they are permitted to conduct as part of the festival is to have food trucks and outdoor vending. So there's no separate planning and zoning permit for those temporary festival or event-based outdoor vending uses. So what we're talking about really is a perennial use, more, season-long presence, more of a permanent presence.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Sure. You're welcome. Our next recommendation was to consolidate uses, and I ran through a bunch of options. We looked into those further to take a look at what the implications are. And there are a few items that it did not make sense, or we felt did not make sense to try to merge with other uses. Those being assembly, as in not congregation, but as in like manufacturing process. You have assembly as a specific use. It is allowed on its own as a use. The issue with assembly, although it's very similar to fabrication, compounding, light manufacturing, it may be a component of all of those uses, is that you allow assembly in a wide range of districts, including DB5. And you do not allow light manufacturing or compounding and fabrication in as many districts. So if we try to merge those together, we'd either prohibit assembly where you allow it, or we would allow those other uses where allowed. However, compounding, fabrication, and light manufacturing were all incredibly similar uses. And we think it makes sense just to bundle those all together and say that light manufacturing includes compounding and fabrication. And so there were some subtle differences in the permit requirements, and we documented all those in the potential impacts. But I don't think anything that would prevent this from working well. The other items included, we had discussed potentially merging community center and municipal facility and just calling it a civic facility, and there are kind of concerns around that name and that description. The other issue is you allow municipal facilities just about everywhere, because that could mean a town garage, it could mean town offices, it means a lot of different things. Whereas a community center is a far more narrow use that's, has a lot of traffic coming in and out, a lot of visitors. So that's allowed in a smaller range of zoning districts. So once again, it for that reason, it doesn't make sense to merge those two uses. And then finally, we looked at a table of comparisons about where these things are allowed: wineries, breweries, and distilleries. And wineries seem to be very distinct from breweries and distilleries, whereas breweries and distilleries looked very much the same in terms of their processes, where they're allowed, how they're regulated, etc. So we recommended just merging brewery and distilleries into a use group. And the only implication there is that you would allow distilleries in the M1 where not currently allowed, which seems to make sense because it's a manufacturing process. But to leave wineries alone. And it's all documented in the memorandum. I don't. Does anyone have any comments or questions based upon the document that we shared and some of the potential impacts?
I'd say keep moving.
Okay. And once again, if you do have something we didn't get a chance to discuss this evening, send your thoughts to Clifton. He forwards everything to me. Okay. And then we'll pick it up at our next meeting.
Just to expand on that, they forward it to the commission as well. So
Exactly.
Your feedback is shared with the entire commission. So
Right.
really, in order to get through these 55 slides in any reasonable time, we're going to have to pick this up.
Yep. Finally, MHD recommendations. We've recommended amending the Maritime Heritage District regulations to remove the floating zone elements. It is where it is. You know, it has the potential to expand in area if the museum acquires some parcels along the edges, but there's no reason why it would be landed anywhere else in town. And so all those aspects of the regulations are non-functional. So it would make more sense to treat this as a base zoning district. We could still maintain all the language and the references to the master plan being the controlling regulation for the uses without disturbing that function of it. So this would mean moving it into a different section of the zoning regulations and treating it like any other zoning district, and while maintaining all the standards, just getting rid of all the dead weight that was associated with the original creation of the zoning district. That's all outlined in the document, and I can coordinate with Clifton. One thing we do want to do is review the master plan that was approved and all of the uses so that we make sure that we capture that. But otherwise, this wouldn't change anything about the district, wouldn't change its name, its boundaries. It's just how we treat it within the regs and where we place it in the document. Okay. All right, so let's get on to the new material because we have a lot to discuss. What I would like to do is walk you through.
Can you hear me?
Listen, yeah, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I had one comment about this whole area, this whole commercial thing. We never talked about the HI 60 zone at all. And, you know, in our workshop, that was a big discussion with everybody to get that going. And I know at one point, whether I said it or we talked about devoting maybe not a whole night or like an hour just to talk about why it's not working and what we haven't brought that up at all. It hasn't been part of any discussion we've had. So is that just off the table?
Yeah, correct.
Is that coming later?
At our December meeting, we had discussed, and I think you introduced this as an idea that you're interested in doing some workshops surrounding that, and the commission was interested in taking a lead, that it deserved more time than we could afford it through this process. So we're deferring any work on that to those workshops or in whatever form that takes.
So that's not part of the zoning rewrite then. We're just going to ignore the HI 60 zone.
Well,
for your part of
yeah, I mean, that seems to be the direction that I've been provided through the commission and through our meetings, that we didn't feel these forums provided us really enough time or space to adequately review those districts or that district, and that you'd prefer to handle that offline or within some workshops or meetings and take the time to really explore it. You know, this process certainly is designed to and intended to address any issues surrounding that zone and all zones. But as you're all well aware, we've got a limited amount of time to do this work.
Is that something that we could take up in the POCD?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The POCD can lay the groundwork for that, and you could use a POCD workshop and that effort to really explore the needs in that area. Come out of that process with some basic recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're, depending on the timing of things, that could inform our work. And if we're still active, then we could take some of those recommendations and run with them. We just don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the time to devote that sort of energy to one zoning district. And we've got to cover the whole town, all its zoning districts, and all aspects of the zoning regulations, which means we have to be pretty very focused in our efforts in order to get through it all, and we can't devote that much time to one zone.
I'm mindful of that. I think this is a subject of a discussion amongst the commission. Good point, Alyssa. Thank you for raising it.
Okay. All right. Any other questions or comments before we get into parking? Okay. So what I'd like to do this evening is go through your parking regulations, through the entire set of regulations, and we'll get as far as we can, and we'll go through from top to bottom. And ultimately, I think that any recommended amendments that come out of this process are likely to take the form of an entirely new Section 13 delivered as one product, right? Rather than these more surgical amendments that we've been conducting, individual recommendations that we've been conducting up till now. I think parking is likely, and depending on this conversation goes, what we would deliver as the recommended amendment would just be an entire new Section 13 to replace the existing and put the new one in. Which isn't to say that all of it has to be rewritten. However, all of it, I think, well, as I'll walk through it, you'll see that there are multiple items across this section that need to be addressed. All right. And some of this is okay. You know, some of this content I think is working pretty well, and I don't see any problems with it. So let's start at the top. Section 13, off-street parking. So that what it does, it regulates all of your off-street parking requirements. There are a couple of other sections in the document outside of Section 13 that also regulate parking or really connect back to this section. But almost all of your parking regulations are located in this section. And it provides requirements on how many parking spaces you have to provide, how should those be designed, what are some of the other considerations, everything connected to parking and loading as well. So first of all, Section 13, you have general requirements. It just provides some basics. There is a little redundancy that we saw here. This item here is redundant with or duplicative of another section of the regs. So we want to strip out redundant items because those are a potential conflict in your regs when something gets changed in one location and not in another. Content regulation should be in one location only, and then you could reference to that location. In this case, this could be removed because we get into, and this surrounds preservation of native vegetation and construction of a parking area. And we've got a whole section that addresses that. So it doesn't need to be here. Outside of that, the rest of this, I think, works okay. There's nothing I wanted to flag here. So let's go to the next, and we've got quite a bit to get through. And as Chuck reminds us, we should keep things moving. All right, Section 13. Section 13.2 allows the commission to modify the parking regulations, and this surrounds mostly the parking requirements. And so it enables you to adjust those by way of a special use permit. Now, what is not entirely clear based upon the language in the regulations, and we see this in more than one spot in section 13, is whether or not a separate special use permit is required to modify the standards. You know, if an applicant has come in, pull a special use permit just for parking modification, or if in the course of a project that requires a special use permit for the project, that can be modified through that special use permit. So we need to ensure that the language describes that adequately, how that process is supposed to work. So there's a deficiency in that. It's kind of vague as to what is intended. So I need to work through that with Candace and Clifton to see how this process has worked in the past and what they think is intended by this. And I don't know if anyone has any kind of institutional knowledge of how this has been treated in the past. Okay, no, all right. So what section 13.2 does, as I mentioned, allows you, the commission, to modify your standards. And section 13.2.1 is in cases of insufficient parking. So it says where the maximum number of parking spaces permitted by these regulations is demonstrated by a parking assessment to be insufficient, you can allow an increase of up to 25%. So your regulations have a minimum, and that's typically what we see for parking requirements, is you need to provide a minimum amount. In some cases, what we see, and not often, is a maximum amount of parking that can be built out. And that's also good protection to ensure that you don't end up with a sea of parking just because someone has room. They want to be prepared for the busiest day of the year. However, you only have 4 uses that have a parking maximum: a marina, yacht club, medical clinic, office building, retail wholesale. So there are only 4 use groups that have a maximum. All the rest of the uses only have minimum, no maximum. So this section of the regs is really addressing this maximum for only 4 uses. So I think our question as we get further into this is, would you like to see maximum parking limits on more uses? And does this section of the regs work? Does this work to allow an increase in parking spaces, to have that maximum, but then have a relief valve? All right, does anyone have experience with an application where they come in, they were limited by your regulations, and they came in for some sort of relief? Does anyone recall an application to that effect?
I cannot
No,
in
no.
my tenure.
Okay. All right. So there's that, and a little cleanup to do here. 25% is mentioned twice. So you don't need to say it once.
Can I just, this
Yeah.
is Lynn again. A couple things on this page.
Yes.
Where it says the location of overflow parking available to the proposed use. It's the last part of the last sentence. I'm not sure because businesses change so often, because, it's a separate contract, totally separate from the permit, et cetera, et cetera. I just wonder if we should allow that at all. We've had several applications come before us talking about, well, we have an agreement with another business, or, well, I can always do X, Y, Z, and we don't have a way really of knowing whether that actually happened, or they've got this special use permit, but then 2 years later something's changed. So I'm not sure this out is any longer a good out. Let's just put it that way. And I'd like to discuss whether that should be deleted. And I also would like to discuss the 25%. You know,
Yep.
whenever we deal with percentages, it kind of makes me nervous, right? So if it's 4 spaces, 25% is 1 space. But if it's, if it's 40 spaces, 25% is 10 spaces. So
Right.
I'm not sure where that 25% came from, and I'm not sure it's the right number. And I don't know what the right number is, but it kind of makes me think it should be on a sliding scale of some sort. I don't know.
Well,
I
mean,
agree. I agree with Lynn,
Yeah.
Francesco, on the
Okay.
last paragraph with the off-site parking and the private agreements between third parties with parking. There are municipalities that have created monsters in their central business districts with this, West Hartford being one of them.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that we should allow it. So I agree with Lynn that it's got to be looked at very carefully.
Well, you folks are kind of getting ahead of me because you have a whole shared use parking section that allows for shared use parking, and it requires an agreement, a covenant. So we can come back to this and explore, kick it around some more. And I see, Ben, did you have your hand raised? Or Bennett, who?
It's me,
Or
it's Ben.
Ben,
No,
yeah.
I just wanted to agree with Chuck and Lynn. I mean, those shared parking agreements have always been problematic, and all you have to do is look at Groton and the situation they have over there with all the restaurants sharing the same spots to know that anything we can do to eliminate that would be great. That's all I've got to say.
Okay.
Yeah, my experience is where it's been allowed, it proliferates and ultimately becomes a problem. And so I do agree with Ben and Lynn that I'm very skeptical that it should even remain at all.
Okay. All right. So I've made that note. We're gonna come back to this in a couple slides. The 25%, where do they come up with that number? Someone just, they had a conversation like the one we're having, and they said 25% seems reasonable, and someone argued for 10, and someone argued for 50%, and they landed on 25. At 25%, I mean, I think that is intended to be a sliding scale, so that if you have 4, you get 1 more space, and if you have 40, you get 10 more. Whether or not that's the right number, I don't know. It seems kind of conservative. It's not a huge number, but maybe it's too much. I don't know. And Ben, did you have another comment or your hand raised from before? No. Okay. Well,
yeah, I just think.
Yeah.
Sorry, Francis.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just think 25% is a big number at this point when we're talking about parking. Especially in the downtown area. So maybe, it's 25% if it's in a different zone. HI 60 or something. I don't know, but it just seems that 25% is a pretty big number when you're talking about that downtown area. I mean, think about just as an example, the Whalers Inn, right? And if they wanted to reduce their parking by 25% based on their, the rooms and the conferences and the this and the that, I'm just not sure that that makes a lot of sense.
This is an increase. This is designed to allow for an increase of 25%.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
Other direction.
Decrease. Sorry. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Lynn, you're kind of getting ahead. You're ahead of us here because we're about to talk about. We're about to go on to another section that does allow the commission to reduce as well. So you're kind of a step ahead.
Okay.
So this allows for increases, and it's only applicable to these 4 uses that have a maximum. And we could talk more about whether or not that maximum works, if it should be applied to more uses, et cetera. And like I said, 25%, I don't know, should it be 20? I don't know.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So section 13, what it does, excessive parking, face parking. It enables the commission to reduce in the required number of parking spaces by up to 25%. So here we're still at the same number. Now we're going in the other direction. Now we're talking about a reduction of 25%. It does, however, require that an area on the property is set aside for future parking. So you have to reserve a grass area or whatever it is for expansion of parking if the use proves to be really generating a lot of parking demand. And once again, 25% is that number. So let's talk about this. I imagine the same, these are where the concerns are. It's about there not being enough parking. Is that adequately addressed by the fact that you require them to set aside a space for future expansion of parking? Has this come through in any recent application or any applications that anyone recalls where someone said, I don't need that much, and you said, all right, well, you can lower your amount by 25%, but you need to, this area here, you need to not build anything there in case you have to expand the parking.
We had something similar to this with the Mystic Diner on a parking evaluation with regard to actual use counts, and it was very confusing. And I agree with what's something that was raised earlier, is that these percentages just seem arbitrary. I mean, I don't know whether if someone wanted to claim this in an application that they would have a traffic engineer come in and talk about, how much parking they're actually going to use with generations of similar uses in other areas to actually provide some science behind what they're requesting. But I again, I have to agree with what was said before. These numbers seem arbitrary. They just picked out of the sky. Why 25? Why not 50? Why not 10? I'm the parking deficiencies that we have already in this town are so enormous that the thought that anyone come in and argue for less parking is seems kind of ridiculous to me. But I'm concerned with where these numbers come from, because if you say they can argue for 25%, as others have mentioned, you're going to get a case for 25%, and I'm not so sure where that number comes from.
Okay.
I agree, and also I just want to say that this is kind of an administrative nightmare, right? I mean, somebody's got to. When do we say, okay, now you got to turn that grassy area into a parking lot? I'm sorry, because we've had 1 complaint, 2 complaints, 5 complaints. I just think that the monitoring of this, just try to say, well, you can set things aside, but we can change our mind based on usage, and then you're going to have to move forward, is just, practically speaking, that's not going to happen.
So is that the issue? Is that this is just impractical? Like once they're done building, that's it. They're done. You're going to be hard pressed to get them to expand in the future.
Then you get into the issue of I've got to modify the drainage system now. Do I have enough capacity in my leaching chambers? Do I? And as Lynn says, it's an administrative nightmare, which is probably justification enough to set it aside.
Yeah, and it certainly costs more for anyone to go back in and construct a second time and potentially have to do upgrades or whatever's needed. Okay, so would one of the ideas coming out of this process be to eliminate this section?
I'm in favor of that.
I am as well.
Right, I will as I usually do, I'll follow up with Clifton and Candace to get a better understanding if this has been, if from their perspective, this has been functional for the town in the past, and we would be doing a tremendous disservice by removing this option, but I will follow up on that. All right, next section. 13.2.3 also allows for parking reductions based upon shared use parking agreements. So this is conducted through a special use permit. Once again, not clear if that's a separate special use permit or done through a special use permit for development that requires a special use permit. But this option is available in the PV5, CS5, DB5, LS5, and HM districts, and allows the reduction of parking up to 40%. There are a bunch of conditions that apply. It shall not apply to residential uses. It's limited to commercial uses, and only apply to customer parking, not employee parking. And the caveat is that off-site parking has to be within 500 feet.
Again, as we said earlier, off-site parking is something that if it can be avoided, it should be avoided. The parking lots are all checkerboarded in Blueback Square, and it doesn't work. You know, and I can see with the parking deficiencies that we have downtown, and someone mentioned earlier, a lot of these businesses turn over. You know, it's going to be very difficult to administer, and I think it's a complication we don't need. But I defer to.
No, I agree with you because I mean we just had that application where, you know, the guy said, "Oh, we had an agreement," and no one can find it. And so
Right.
how enforceable is it? You know, then they sell the property, goes, "No, you can't use this as parking anymore. Like you're done."
Right.
And I think that again, administratively, um, proving it, keeping it there forever, and it's just a complication that we don't need. It's hard to do it. I think
Very difficult.
it's too hard to approve it. It's too hard for the applicant, and you know that they're going to come up with some, you know, some screwy shared arrangement that's not going to hold up.
I agree. I
You
agree
know?
wholeheartedly. You know, it's in West Hartford. It's protected with cross easements, and
Right.
it's a title search nightmare. So it's just honestly, I think it's an accommodation for developers and nothing else. And it's very difficult to administer. So I'm not.
Where this sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go right ahead.
Well, where this came from, I remember when we put this in the regulations, it was the idea was like churches, you know, like they don't use their parking lots every single day. They don't use them on Sunday. So could somebody, you know, could a restaurant use a church parking lot on a Saturday night? And
Mhm.
that was sort of the idea behind this regulation for things that have cross hours. Is that the right word?
Right.
You know, a school next to something else that's only open at night. And that's where this came from. But I think the execution never really worked. The idea is good. The execution is too hard.
Mm-hmm.
Alyssa,
The
do you
idea
recall?
is good. The idea is good. It has very limited application though, and because we can't limit it to just the church, which
Right.
you know works almost everywhere you do it. It becomes complicated when two businesses start to do it, and
Right. That's the thing. Right.
I think you said it very well. That you know it's difficult to administer, and it was a good idea to begin with, but I think it's going to further complicate the town's parking problem, and
Mhm.
eventually become impossible to administer.
And Alyssa, do you recall where the 40% number came from?
No. Whether we did
Okay.
some research or, did
Right.
some examples,
Sure.
but no, I don't actually remember.
Okay.
But I just remember having this huge, I was on the commission when we redid all the parking regulations.
Yeah. Okay.
So what I'm
So-
hearing is that we want to eliminate this 13.2.3. Yeah, I agree with that.
I would be in favor of that. I don't know what we do with the areas that are grandfathered in, but I think we're probably stuck with them. But I think to allow further proliferation of this is a mistake. You know, a big mistake.
And Chuck, to that question, they become non-conforming uses like any other use.
Roger. Okay.
Yeah.
Hey guys, but this is Dave Resendes. I got kicked off there for a second. We authorized the fish camp on Tuesday that had a 25% reduction. So it seems like we use this at least sometimes.
Based upon some shared parking arrangement off-site, is that what it was based upon?
No, just they didn't have enough space.
Just a flat out reduction.
Correct. Is that
Okay.
right, folks?
That was non-conforming.
Yeah, but
that was non-conforming.
I
believe.
thought that had to do with the percentage of non-conformity they had now, or
Right.
that wasn't the exact same thing. It wasn't.
It wasn't. No. No. It was
right.
it was non-conforming. That's what the issue was there.
Okay.
And it was reducing the non-conformity.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Yeah,
Because
Yeah.
it should have had more to begin with. Yeah, it was reducing the non-conformity. That's
Correct.
the key, Alyssa. That's correct.
Right. Moving in the right direction, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I've made a note to potentially eliminate this section. There are a couple of minor issues with it as it is. It's not clear exactly which type of uses it's allowed to be applied to. The distance of 500 feet, it's not clear if that's a radius or a walking distance, and those two can vary quite a bit. So as it is, there are some things that would need to be corrected. Okay, let's move on. Dedicated off-site parking. So this is not the same as a shared use arrangement. This simply, you have parking, it's not on the parcel, right? It's on another parcel. And it's off, so that makes it off-site, but it may be under the same ownership. So this is very similar to what we just talked about. It has to be within 500 feet. It's limited to the PV5, DB5, LS5, HM districts. Requires a special use permit. There has to be a signed agreement between the applicant and the owner. So the section we just reviewed only requires the applicant to demonstrate that, hey, there's lots of parking all around me. There's public parking, there's on-street parking. It doesn't require any sort of formal agreement. This section requires a formal agreement because you have an off-site parking, it's privately held. It's a facility, a lot, whatever it may be. And so you require that the applicant, the owner, the off-site parcel shall have an agreement that runs for the duration of the special use permit. Termination revokes the permit, or any change in the conditions of property can revoke the permit, require modification of the permit. It also it potentially requires a walkway connection to be built between the two facilities if needed. And it requires it to be within 500 feet as well. So this is like a more robust version of 13.2.3, which is a little more casual, and you just have to impress us that there's plenty of parking. This one, you have to demonstrate that there's an agreement. However, this one, there's no limit on how much of that parking. So presumably it could be 100% of your parking. There's no 40% limit. So you allow them to go higher with the amount of parking provided off-site, but you require an agreement. You're a little stricter as to how that is provided. I imagine the same concerns about this, right?
Similar, not to the same extent. Is there a proximity? Does the
500 feet, 500 feet with this one as
500
well.
feet? Okay.
Yes, correct. Correct.
Not to the same extent, but it is a complication.
Yeah.
I think that this is much more structured, and there's clawbacks if the agreement all of a sudden evaporates.
Yeah.
I think the thing with this is based, and this is Lynn again, based on the situation we have in the town, is that there's no guarantee, basically, that if you don't have parking on site, and you say, oh yeah, there's no problem, you can park, you can park down the street, I've got an agreement, this, that, and the other thing, that they're going to do that, right? And so it kind of clogs up the street parking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just not sure that this is appropriate. I don't like to walk any. I want the parking to be at the place that I'm going into to do whatever it is that I'm going to be doing. And if somebody says, yeah, you're okay, you can, you can eat here, but you're gonna park, you got parking two blocks down or wherever. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to look for a spot in the road, or I'm going to look for a spot in, the next parking that's available in somebody else's establishment. And that's the thing. What about the person next door that has the parking, right? It kind of ruins it for that guy. So no, I don't think this is appropriate, especially for, that downtown area at all.
If we were to eliminate some of these prior sections and keep this one, would you at least want to see an upper limit on how much off-site parking could be provided here? There's no upper limit specified. It's not 40%. It's not 25%. There's no upper limit specified. And Lynn, maybe your argument is no, not at all. 0%. But I wonder if anyone else has thoughts on this.
I think the limit would help, and I think that this may give us some flexibility in historic districts where it's not possible to provide parking adjacent to the use. It may give the commission an option that in some cases would work. So I'm not as quick to dismiss this, but I also recognize the comments that Lynn raises are valid as well. So I think we've got to think more about this.
I was going to say the same thing. I'd want to see some thoughts. I don't know, think about this one a little bit more. I go back to, if the other person sells their property, how's it enforced?
Mm-hmm.
They're just not there anymore, but you can't tell the guy like, okay, now you don't have parking, you have to shut down. You just can't do that. And we would never do it. So it's like, oh yeah, well, you're, it's not invalid anymore, but it's okay because you're still there. And no one's going to ever track it. It's never going to be enforced. So basically you're saying you're getting a reduction in parking. They might come up with some.
Unless it was like an easement and, there were a negative easement on someone else's property, those types of things could be tracked, but you're right. This is what's happened in towns that have permitted this, and it's very complicated to administer. You create a huge complication, particularly in an area where, as Lynn said, these businesses turn over. It's one retail establishment one week and another week it's something else. It's one restaurant one week, the next week it's another restaurant. It's all of these things as they change hands are very difficult to administer. So
This
you know,
just happened to us at Andiamo.
yeah, yep.
When they said they had put that arrangement, and Clifton, they looked for it, they couldn't find it.
Right, exactly. That's a very good example. A very good
And then
example.
how do you protect the the next door business for somebody not using their spots that they've got, right, on their
Yeah.
premise?
Yeah, well,
How do
it's
you,
obviously beyond the capacity of the town to do so, and that's the issue. That's the challenge.
right? So it's beyond the capacity of the town. Now you've put that on the business owner, and now you've created a whole different problem. So I understand wanting to think this through because it would be a big change, but I just think for all the reasons that have just been stated, this just isn't a good idea at this time. We can always put it back in later on if we come up with a grand parking solution, right? But at this time for the town, this isn't a good idea.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I would tend to agree with that. I would just want to make sure that we're not eliminating something that we're not putting our foot in a bear trap here. But I tend to agree with everything you just said. I really do.
Sal
Just a quick
had
question.
his hand raised. Sal, go ahead.
Okay, so what was put forward to EDC was to actually remove parking requirements with PV5. And the reason being is, unlike Mystic, when somebody's driving around in downtown Pawcatuck, if they don't see parking or, they'll actually go over to Westerly or Mystic, right? So, that begs the question, do we need more parking in Pawcatuck as opposed to reducing the requirement? And the thought process behind it was, you know what, maybe we should be allowing, less parking because we want to fill up the downtown. We want to actually have more commercial spaces. And a lot of people have actually come forward, at multiple meetings we've had with EDC, planning and zoning, to say that, we want to see more commercial activity in downtown. We want restaurants, cafes, bars. The problem is, a lot of these places can't actually provide, the parking requirements that are necessary. Okay. And, this begs the question, at looking at the Section 13 off-street parking, what if the municipality wanted to actually, help foster this? There are some municipal spots. There's actually places off of Cogswell Street, which is a dead end right along the Mystic River in downtown, where, somebody could, work to get an agreement to satisfy the parking requirements. But, when we were looking at PV5, we filled up an entire fire station in Pawcatuck because people came out in high numbers because they wanted, us to fill in the downtown with more stuff. Okay. And the problem is that with that is twofold. One is the surrounding zone, which we've talked about. Two is, a parking issue. Jim Lathrop, who owns a number of buildings in downtown, had actually presented this idea to what do you call it, the EDC, to bring forward over to P&Z for this, to actually remove some of the parking requirements on a zone basis with regard to PV5. But I absolutely think that, should be looking at, off-street parking alternatives for some of these places because, there's buildings situated in old, lots that had prior zones that, are just too restrictive. So what are you going to do to, fill up these buildings, right? What are you going to do to actually satisfy these parking requirements? It's going to be extremely difficult for them to do so, and they're just going to remain empty. or they're going to have, a very minimal use, a use that, really isn't appropriate for our downtown, which should be, our high density area. So food for thought. I think, there should obviously be, a big consideration with regard to Pawcatuck, with regard to relaxing the parking requirements for businesses.
Sal, let's come back to that discussion because I do have a slide here on the Pawcatuck Village overlay.
I'm sorry,
parking
I can't
zone.
hear you.
Can everyone else hear me okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Sal, let's come back to that. I've got a slide here to discuss the overlay zone for Pawcatuck Village, which is intended to provide some parking relief. So let's pick that back up when we get to that. Okay.
I think we've got to move on from this.
I agree.
But obviously, subject of a lot more discussion.
All right. Shared on-site parking. You have a lot of tools in the toolbox. Shared on-site parking allows for two different establishments on the same parcel that have different times of operation, time of day operation, like an office and a restaurant, to share parking, and they don't each have to provide the total number of parking individually they would be required to provide, but rather cumulatively, they could provide parking based upon time of use. So that's exactly what this is intended to allow. It is granted by special use permit. It does require an applicant to do some sort of study or provide some information demonstrating how their operation would work in a shared use arrangement. I think the effective part about this is on the same parcel, it's on the same property, and it's controlled by the same, in most conditions, controlled by the same ownership group.
Again, though, I think this is the
Yeah.
ultimate nightmare. You have two uses that have peaks that are offset. One that has activity in the morning and the afternoon, and the other that has activity at night. It works great in the beginning until the tenants change.
Yeah.
And when the tenants change, you've got gridlock. So I think as long as it's the initial tenants and the formula, works for those tenants, that's great until the tenants change, and tenants change frequently down here. So it's a very difficult thing to administer and could add significantly to an already existing problem.
Like changes in use like that, if the tenant changes, say from a restaurant to something else, they have to come in front of us for that and show that they have the parking.
Anyone else
Right.
have thoughts on this section?
I mean,
So
my
I
other thought was,
think that, oh, go ahead.
sorry, my other thought was to maybe add something that, under the same ownership or to that.
Yeah.
Like you just said, usually this is buildings that have the same ownership.
Correct, but we don't limit it to such arrangement. Correct. Yeah.
No, but we could.
But we could, absolutely.
That's what I'm saying. We could say, because
that
otherwise
way,
you're talking
I
about
think
two
that's a good
owners.
suggestion. I think that's a good suggestion because the owner has an interest in making sure it works.
Yeah.
I support that change.
So this just came up
Yeah.
with that like dog lady, the dog physical therapist lady, right? Over by the police station, right?
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a great example. Also, I believe the little plaza kind of kitty corner to Sea Swirl that has I think it's an Indian restaurant and a hair
Yes.
salon.
Yes.
I think they have that kind of an arrangement
They do.
as well.
They do.
Yeah.
Another good example.
But I think tightening things up, as Alyssa has suggested, and putting that in the reg, that the entire property must be owned. So it's not just the land, but the buildings themselves have to be owned by, the same person. I think it's key.
I agree. I agree.
Okay. All right, anything else on this section? All right, let's move on. Okay, section, you have a lot of mechanisms here to provide flexibility in your parking regs. 13.2.6, residential parking agreements requires that a covenant for any off-site parking or shared parking agreement for residential uses be filed in the land records. So here, unlike commercial records where you may require some sort of agreement that's attached to the special use permit, or any sort of residential arrangements, which you do allow, you require a covenant be filed in the land records for any of those residential agreements, which is different from the way you treat commercial uses. Any thoughts on this? Chuck, I think this kind of touches upon what you mentioned earlier about requiring some sort of easement. You know, this is getting attached to the land record.
It's easier to administer when there's easements, you know, it's at least documented, and it isn't like the Adiamo thing, nobody can find the agreement.
Yeah, it would be on file with the town.
Correct.
Is there an interest? So everything we just talked about, I think, surrounded mostly commercial uses, and the examples that were pointed to were businesses. Are there concerns or thoughts around residential uses that have off-site parking agreements or shared parking agreements? Is that still the same concerns?
I'm trying to think about maybe a large multifamily complex that had a large off-site parking agreement, you know, as maybe an extreme example where this would apply, and what the consequences of that might be in a residential zone. You know, where generally the establishment of large bituminous concrete parking lots is not desirable in residential zones. But I guess all of this would have to come before us if it were a multifamily dwelling. So we would have some purview over that. So I guess this doesn't look like it's as difficult to administer. I don't know how frequent this occurs in practice in town where somebody needs an off-site parking space for a resident. Maybe in some of the smaller lots downtown.
Yeah. So Chuck, this is Lynn. You know, the only thing I can think of, and it's not in Stonington, but it's, you know, the condos on the other in Groton in downtown Mystic, you know, where the stores are, you know, down on the first floor, and then they've got the condos right above them, right along the river. I can't remember what the building is called.
By S&P kind of.
Yeah,
Those?
yeah, like across the river on the other side.
Oh, Steamboat Wharf.
Yeah, but on the other side of the road, the new ones, the ones that were just built.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, they don't have any parking. So where do those people park? I mean, that's kind of what. I mean, if we think about, well, how would we incorporate this in Stonington? That would be an example of if something like that was built mixed use. Where do those residents, you know, who own the condos or rent the condos, or where are they parking? I have no idea.
Do you think we should get some examples of where this is used? maybe it'll help us to decide.
That might help to picture it.
How we might want to structure the regulations so that we can continue to permit what's worked, but maybe, you know, try to look forward a little bit to see, is there some safeguards that we have to put in here to ensure that you know we're not setting a bear trap for ourselves. But I think your example, Lynn, is a good one. Someone could answer that question for us, and we'd realize how some of these things work, and maybe this is a valid regulation that needs to continue.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say as well in this is, would it make more sense if it was a mixed residential use, that somehow we tie the number of parking spaces to the number of bedrooms in the unit?
Well, you do,
Like-
your parking regulations do that to some extent already.
Yeah, they have a calculation, I think.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, there's,
it just doesn't have to be in
Yeah.
this particular reg.
No,
Okay,
no,
all right,
right.
the
all right. I
required
just wanted to make sure.
required
Yeah.
parking to support a multifamily complex is a calculation, and that
Yeah.
calculation will remain. But it's a good question. It just doesn't. It's not here. It's in the required parking calculations.
Okay, but again, I mean, this could just be two residential units on top of a store.
Right.
could be.
I don't
Right.
think
Good-
would
good
be,
example.
you know.
Good example. That has to have that by necessity has to have off-site parking, and how much of that do we have? How does it work now? And I think that will help us to understand how we should keep this as is or rewrite it.
Mm-hmm.
So what I will do between now and our next meeting is I will follow up with Clifton to see if we can get some sort of list of properties that have shared use parking or off-site parking agreements or arrangements. And that'll hopefully help inform our discussion.
I think that might help with regard to all of these sort of off-site options that we're talking about. To what extent are they used and in place right now? It might help on all of these, but in particular this one.
What they did with that new building in Groton is they have gated parking behind it off of Gravel Street, designated for the residents.
All right. Thank you, Maggie.
Yep.
Just a quick question. This is Bennett here. If you had two restaurants that both got approved, both had the same size lots, one restaurant became very popular and the other one was not or was closed. One fills up very quick and then you get all the overflow that goes into the other one. Is it up to, I guess, the other, restaurant two owner I guess it's their insurance, it's their parking lot, and it's their regulation of, if you park and you're not staying here, you're going to get towed. Is that more of a on-site thing than us?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's privately handled. Hopefully, what often happens in that scenario is that there's some sort of agreement, whether formal or informal, where sometimes there's compensation, kind of rent almost, that's paid to the property owner that is providing overflow parking. And if that agreement does not exist, or if there are issues surrounding that, then it's enforced by the property owner through towing.
This sort of reared its head again. The same question that Bennett just raised.
Yeah.
In the Mystic Diner application with the motel reconstruction, where there are claims that there's overflow parking from Mystic Village, that some of the diner people are parking in Mystic Village, that everybody's all over the place because all the parking lots are full. But it raises a question of, is a very difficult thing to manage if there isn't enough parking for all the uses.
Yeah.
But I think it's also one of those things. Sorry, Bennett brings up a really interesting point, because one of the things that no one wants to start towing people's cars. It makes the town look bad.
You're right.
And I think we would really want, and so putting the onus of the enforcement on the restaurant owner or the property owner or whatever to start towing cars is an awful thing to consider, because then, then the tourists won't come. Oh, I went to Mystic to have dinner and my car got towed because there was no parking.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm,
that
I'm
happens
just
in New
thinking.
York City, not
Yeah, it's a PR night. It was a PR nightmare.
a nightmare.
I'm
Right.
just thinking, even for an example, the Chelsea Groton and Groton in Mystic. When we were growing up, it said, or 10 years ago, they had signs that said, it's only Chelsea Groton parking. All others will be towed. But
Mm.
I was always didn't want to park there because that makes sense. But then other people were, well, after it's 5 o'clock and the bank is closed, therefore you can park there.
That's
And I
me.
know when they put the pay parking in, people were up in arms of that they took all their free parking away. But what if there's a sign there, does it matter if they're closed or not? Or, there's no hours on the tow sign. So
I always park there. I forgot I have an account at Chelsea Groton, so I get to park there. Um, but yeah, I just think towing is something we don't want to, so, and it's back to the enforcement and putting it on the owner to have people towed. Mystic Stonington doesn't need that as that kind of a nightmare.
sure. I just think if you have if there's no street parking and there's a parking lot that's open, I think people, if you have a dinner reservation and people start to get desperate, they're just going to park wherever. And you
Oh
could
no, they
very
will,
easily,
right.
hop into
Oh,
the
exactly.
CVS and buy a stick of gum and then, walk around for the next 2 hours. So, but to your point, oh, well, I have a CVS membership, right? I went there for a Gatorade, and I left my car
I
there
can
for
park
12
there.
hours. So
I can
therefore,
park there.
I'm legal, but
Okay, so I think we've kicked the tires on this. I'll follow up with Clifton, see if we can get a list of properties they're aware of that have agreements in place, and we'll reconvene on this at our next meeting. Okay, so these next couple of sections get into some of the details about what you require for any sort of parking modification. So you give yourself the authority to require a parking assessment to be conducted by a professional engineer and to provide an estimate of what the parking requirements are, and then also how the parking arrangement would be conducted, how it would be designed, hours of use, range of use, et cetera. So for all these, you do have the right to request or require a parking assessment before you award any sort of arrangement or reduction or increase, or whatever it may be. All right. Okay. So section 13.3 is the beginning of the actual parking space requirements. And this provides you guidance into how many parking spaces an applicant needs to provide based upon their use or mixture of uses and the scale of development. And so we've got a few tables. It spans a few pages to that effect. And so I'll go through those fairly quickly. And what I'm trying to impress upon you is the fact there are a lot of gaps here. There are a lot of uses for which a parking requirement is not identified. And in those cases, it falls upon you, the commission, to determine what is appropriate. So these are presented in tables and they are grouped together in similar types of uses. And I'm not quite, fire stations is one of the few civic or municipal facilities that's called out. I'm not quite sure why it's grouped with auto service, other than the fact they have bay doors. That's about the only thing they have in common. But parking is required. There are a number of different standards you use to identify how much parking you need. The most common one is gross floor area, but you also use seats, number of attendees, number of employees, number of beds, number of rooms, berths or slips, number of bays, number of dwelling units, and there are a couple other standards mixed in there.
Number of seats in the restaurant.
Yeah, seats right here, the second one. So you have all these various metrics.
This is very typical. Very typical.
It is very typical, and I can tell you the challenges surround.
There's some science behind this.
There's a lot of art as well.
Correct.
The The challenges that we see, that I see in some of these metrics are that they are variable and they cannot be demonstrated on a plan, right? They are reported, they're self-reported, and they're very difficult to measure, and they're highly variable. The number of seats, by example, number of attendees, number of employees, all of those can fluctuate significantly. And so it is not a good practice to build upon things that cannot be measured, that are highly variable, that depend upon self-reporting. It's much better to go towards a standard that is fixed and you can measure. And if it is expanded, it has to come before you in some capacity, such as with floor area, right? You need a building permit or a zoning permit, and there's a mechanism by which that can be brought to your attention, and you could then potentially require more parking in order to allow for that expansion, unlike hiring more employees or adding a few more seats, whatever it may be. All right, so that's the challenge. So a range is here. So you have, by example, I'm not going to go through each one of these. An auto station, you need 1 parking space per bay plus 1 space per 200 square feet of building gross floor area. Churches is 1 for every 4 seats, and it goes down the list. And we've got 3 pages of this, a number of different tables. So we have requirements for manufacturing, medical clinics, breweries, offices, outdoor vendors, residential. The residential is broken up by studio or 1 bedroom, which requires 1 space per dwelling unit, and by 2 or more bedrooms, which require 2 spaces per dwelling unit. And that is a fairly I hesitate to use the word conservative because it actually moves in the other direction. It's a minimal standard. What we see in many communities is higher, and the direction we're usually trying to go is to a lower requirement, so as not to provide a barrier to development of housing. So I wouldn't suggest, at least from my perspective, that these numbers are problematic at all. They're just on the lower side of what we see. The residential requirements vary a little bit by zoning districts, so they're not uniform across the entire town. By example, in the DB5 and the PV5, it's limited to 1 per dwelling unit. So it doesn't matter how many bedrooms you have or what type of dwelling unit. It's just 1. There's no 2 if you're at 2 bedrooms.
Didn't the state statutes trump parking requirements with regard to residential? I thought I remember something around the time that 830G came out. Yeah. There was something with regard to parking. Is that accounted for here?
No, that rings a bell. That does ring a bell in my head.
No, there's no restriction on that unless it's part of an 830G application, in which case
only if it's 830G.
Yeah, then they're not subject to any of your zoning
I think you're right.
They can seek relief not only for the development but also from your parking requirements.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Outside of that, there's no other state statute that would interfere with your parking requirements that I'm at least that I'm aware of.
No, I think you're correct. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. Restaurants, you have a requirement by the number of seats and also by employee. Sales, it's by gross floor area. Schools, by the number of students. And it varies. Of course, that demand can vary based upon the type of school, the age range, et cetera. But you have a flat requirement. Theaters by seats, funeral homes by seats, warehousing by gross floor area.
I think we can review this list. I think.
Yeah, I just want to what I want to impress upon everyone is the fact you have standards that vary quite a bit in how they measure, in the way in which you require the parking. And what I'm going to recommend doing is moving towards a more standardized system. Okay, that's what I'm trying to set up here. All right, so those are your requirements. The next are just all the how you build parking layout, and we worked in phase one. We fixed all these numbers and we did all these nice graphics, so that's all set. Parking surface, these are pretty good, except we should want to make sure we exclude porous pavement from your aquifer protection area. Your aquifer protection area regs already prohibit that sort of thing, but we probably want to make reference to that here. Otherwise, parking surface, yeah, you have to have a paved surface, basically. You have standards on driveways. This is all pretty good, right? Basic standards on driveway length and width and the throat of the driveway, which means you can't have parking spaces butting up right against the street because you don't want people backing out in the street. You don't want people to be trapped in their spaces when they're trying to get out. Handicap accessible, that's all in place, although we should update the signage requirement. The international symbol is still that old stick figure symbol, and Connecticut adopted the dynamic accessibility symbol, so we should swap that out with this. Outside of that, these are up to par. They're really referencing Connecticut General Statute and Building Code, which has all the standards. You don't need to replicate that in the regs. You just need to point to where to go to find those standards. Electric vehicle charging, we added this in phase one as required by the state. So that's compliant and that's all set. Bicycle parking, we've got some pretty nice regs on how bicycle parking should be built and located, but we don't actually have a bicycle parking requirement. This is just if you build it, this is how it should be. But we don't have a number, and you require for new multifamily developments 4 or more, but we don't have a number. So I wonder if we should actually attach a number to this. And typically we use a percentage of the parking, vehicular parking required. So if you require, we'll do like 10%. So if you require 100 car spaces, you provide 10 bike spaces. All right, does that make sense?
Again,
yeah, that makes sense to me.
I mean, it does make sense, you know, but I don't know how adequate that 10% is. If there's some science around that, yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I think the bike spaces are a good idea.
That's a standard we've used in other communities, and it hasn't been in place in the places we worked long enough, or I haven't had reporting back as to how that plays out. But I can tell you when we take a look at bicycling and commuter numbers, how people commute, and number of recreational bicyclists, you're at bicycle commuting in Connecticut, you're at like 1 or 2%, depending on what community you're in, maybe as high as 5% in a place like New Haven. You do also have recreational cycling, and you know, a certain percentage of people cycle. So 10% kind of hits that spot in the middle. And it's a pretty low standard. You know, if you have 20 off-street parking spaces, you need to put in 2 bike racks. And so it's a pretty low standard to meet. Point being, though, if you don't have a minimum requirement, you do require bike parking, but someone could put in 1 rack and meet their requirement and have 100 units and 200 parking spaces, and they put in 1 rack and they've met their requirement. So we should tie it. Makes sense to associate it with vehicular parking. And this is a very low cost, low space thing for anyone to provide relative to a parking lot for cars.
Yeah, and again, you know, a lot of people are beginning to bike, especially in the more congested areas, because they can't park their car. So, but I have a question about this. So it says, the first line says, bicycle parking facilities shall be provided as part of any new multi-family development of 4 units. Okay. New retail office and institutional developments, and all transit transfer stations and park and ride lots. New retail, office, and institutional development. So, can you just define that for me? A new retail. What does that mean? A development. Yeah. So, somebody comes in and they're changing store front. Is that now new retail?
So if you have new construction associated with any of this. So this is my interpretation, because we didn't write this regulation. It was part of the original language from your pre-existing regs. We just brought it in during phase one. So my interpretation of this is to mean new construction. So if you have re-tenanting, you don't have to then provide bike racks. It's if you're building new construction, that's when you get triggered to have to provide a bike rack.
And have we been compliant with this?
Maybe not.
Well, maybe it's because we don't have a minimum. You know, we don't say what our minimum is. So
yeah, one would do it currently.
Yeah. I think this is very interesting, and I think there might need to be some clarification in the language, just based on our conversation that we've just had. And what if it's not the entire building? What if they're just adding, another floor? Is it a 50% increase in, whatever? Can we put some parameters around that for clarity and kind of leaning towards we want spaces for people to keep their bicycles?
The easiest thing to do would be to tie it to the construction of new parking spaces. That would be the easiest thing to do. You build a new parking space, you have to provide X percentage of bike racks. The more nuanced thing to do, which we could still do, is to require any sort of redevelopment, even if there are not new parking spaces being built, to require bicycle racks to then be installed.
I sort of like that option with clarification, because most of what you see around here is redevelopment, not new construction.
Okay.
I think you're going to get more impact, and as Lynn says, the number of bikes on the street is increasing, and I think it's appropriate to plan for the parking of those bikes.
Oh yeah, I mean, what we don't want is a bunch of bikes around a light pole, kind of all tied in, or a park bench or something like that. And we want to promote this. I mean, we'll want to promote this. One of the things when we did the survey of residents years ago, one of the things they want the town to do is to create bike paths. So I think this is good to do that.
Okay.
I have to keep moving here, Francesco.
Yes, of course. So we'll sharpen the pencil on that. Try to flesh that out a little bit more. We'll come back with a recommendation for that. Off-street loading berths. We addressed this in phase one. You had excessive requirements. We essentially reduced those by one berth for all these various thresholds of uses and different types of uses. So I think we're in good shape now because we addressed it in phase one. We reined it in. It's far more reasonable now. Okay. Parking lot design standards. There's quite a bit to this section. You require preservation of vegetation. This is what I mentioned earlier, that you had some redundancy. You require that here. Getting into the specific design standards. You have standards that are really intended to ensure that parking lots are landscape and that stormwater is adequately managed and that vehicles are kept in the parking lot. So you have some basic curb requirements. However, we think you need to ensure that the curbing requirement is adequately described so that you allow for the use of drainage swales and rain gardens, which require the curb to either be absent or reduced in some areas for drainage. As it is currently written, it makes it look like you have to have curbing everywhere. So we need to fix
There
that.
used to be,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still in there. We
Mhm.
did do that at one point, put in a requirement that we encouraged rain gardens and bioinfiltration. And if they weren't, we were, in order to promote that, we required granite curbing.
Okay,
that
yeah,
might have
talk
gotten
about
taken
that
out.
because that's what we're looking at right here. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Help me understand it, because that's item
We put that
3.
in there as a deterrent because it's so expensive that they would do rain gardens and bioinfiltration in the middle instead of granite
Okay.
curbing. And that was our intent. I think that was never enforced in any applications. I don't know if that's true, but are you questioning why it says granite curbing?
Yeah, and then it also suggests, it just seemed out of place in this line. If you have a requirement that curbing be granite, it shouldn't be mixed in with your stormwater runoff and rain gardens. It should just be a separate line. All curbing
Well,
shall
we
be
wanted to
granite.
say, if you're not going to do a rain garden, you have to do granite curbing, was the intent of that, why it's there.
Oh,
I think it's an excellent stalking horse. To be honest with you,
okay.
to get people to do rain gardens.
I mean,
All
that's
right.
why I could tell you, because I was on, Jason,
Okay.
Jason was the planner, and we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make them do rain gardens and things like that. And we're
Okay.
like, let's put in granite curbing. That'd be fun.
So that's kind of tacked on at the end. I think we just need to be more clear about that. So do I understand that what is intended is that all curbing in parking lots needs to be granite, and where curbing is not required is where it is supporting the use of a rain garden or a drainage swale or something. Is that?
I mean, that was
is
our
that what
intent of the granite.
Yeah. Is that what's actually required? Do you require all your off-street parking to have granite curbing?
I don't think that's enforced.
No, it's not enforced. That's the
Well,
problem. I think that people never, like,
Yeah.
I don't know, planners never saw it. They were like, oh, that's not really a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's why it's in there.
Yeah,
You
there's a
say
lot of lip
shall and
curbing.
not should.
Lip
So
curbing is
that's
used everywhere.
What
We
do we
also have
wanna
a big
do?
problem with maintenance of
Yeah.
rain gardens and
Yes.
swales.
Yes.
True.
So I don't know if that's something you want to put in here, that it's, you don't just put it
Yeah.
in once and then a year later fill it in.
No, they had
Well,
to do
right.
as part of that, they had to do a maintenance plan.
A best management practices, is always included with these. I'm not so sure how that's enforced, but BMP's best management practices with regard to rain gardens and detention basins and leaching systems are always required by the town engineer when these systems go in. As things change hands, I think those get lost, but it's a hard thing to administer. But they do
Yeah,
have to be
it-
maintained. You're correct.
It must be difficult to enforce. The YMCA has filled in half of their in the parking lot drainage, and people just park right on top of it.
Mhm.
And so
Unfortunate.
it's impervious in one sense. They removed the trees, they put, just put gravel in there, and now people just park on top of it. So it's all packed down.
Yeah.
A lot
and
of
it may
a
as
lot of
well be
times
paved.
a lot of times they're designed with wheel stops and ways to keep vehicles from doing just what you're
Driving
saying
in.
when they're well designed. But there are cases where you're right. People are parking in the rain gardens and all of a sudden they disappear. So
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's just the history of that line in the.
All right, thank you. It helps me
Thank you.
understand
That's
it a
helpful.
lot more because
Very
that
helpful.
seemed out of place. So what do we
Can
do with this
add
granite?
something? Oh,
Yeah.
oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Lynn, go ahead.
If-
And what I want to get at is what we do with this.
So I was just going to say, if we're serious and we want the rain gardens and they need to be maintained, is there a fine associated with not maintaining them properly? And does that need to be in here? Can we
Somebody would
beef
need to
that up?
inspect them. Yeah.
Right.
just a
So
note,
you
yeah,
have a complaint. So as an example, we just had this discussion, right? The YMCA is allowing cars to park on their rain gardens, whatever. I don't know, the bike shop, the street floods every time it rains. Has somebody, what's your maintenance program for your rain garden? You know, you don't have one, you haven't done it, there's a fine. Sure,
They,
somebody has to meet, so the zoning enforcement officer, I guess, but
they
I
are
don't know
it
whether you
has to
supposed to
can,
be.
be submitting, maintenance, stormwater maintenance plans as required on the site, the site plans
Yeah.
correct.
when you do. So,
And they are,
I'm,
they
I'm
are.
wondering
I
if
think
this,
the only time we see that is when we were in that aquafloor
the protection
zone
zone.
out where we were talking, about where the old theater was, where it was a very, a very sensitive area in the environment. We wanted to make sure, but other than that, I don't think we talked too much about maintenance plans for
No,
rain
we
You
have,
gardens.
probably
Lynn.
don't, you might not see them.
We
The
have.
engineer would review them.
We
Okay.
definitely have get
and
we definitely got management plans with these. I don't think the commission always sees them, Lynn, but
Mm.
we
Okay.
definitely get management plans with these. I remember specifically. Do you remember when the Tractor Supply had another? They built a hotel next to Tractor Supply, and
Yes.
the detention basin was all poorly maintained from Tractor Supply, and they
Yes, I
had
do
to
remember that.
and they had to drag out the old maintenance plan and force the owners of the complex to come in and implement the maintenance plan and clean it. But we did have a maintenance plan. But I
Yeah.
think it highlights what we've said is that these things usually are ignored once they're built. And there probably ought to be better enforcement. Now, whether it's fines or annual inspections or whatever, maybe there's something we could put in here to incentivize better maintenance.
and when we were talking about resilience and environmental issues, we were also talking about incentivizing depaving or disconnecting paving so as to control the flooding or runoff.
Correct.
So I don't know if it turns up in a different section or if this is the place where we want to consider that, or if we've considered it already.
The town engineer, I think, Maggie, has put together a design manual, and I think it gets into like the MS4 subject
Mhm.
of
Okay.
stormwater management more, but I'm not sure on that. And it may be
There,
something it may be an area where you want to coordinate with the town engineer here a bit. I think he has a design manual, and I think that design manual gets into, disconnecting and less structured catch basin conduit type systems that directly discharge everything into water courses.
when,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
again, back when we were doing these rewrites, at one point when I was on the commission before, we had a committee that took all the technical standards out of the subdivision regs and of the zoning and wrote a technical standards manual just because it's easier to update those as, things change. And of course, everything has to go by the state, stormwater
Correct.
manual, the state erosion control manual, and we put that all in the technical standards manual. So there's references to that.
Right.
And
Don't you
more
think?
so with the subdivision regulations and the drainage structures associated with new roadways and things like that. But there is a technical standards manual that's different than these.
Right. And I think
Thank you.
this requires coordination with that. And
Right.
as you said, technical standards, stormwater management practices, stormwater detention requirements are better handled because, like you said, it's easier to update as the MS4 and beyond regulations on stormwater discharge continue to change. So I think some of this is going to require coordination with the town engineer because he's done some work on this. So
Yeah.
I think you got to reach out to him before we go too much further on this to coordinate with him on technical standards.
Okay, which we don't, as Alyssa correctly points out, the best place for those to live is in a separate technical standards document. We don't want to replicate that here.
Right.
A couple of things I'd like to remind everyone of, and this goes back several months now, but much earlier in our phase 2 work, we've recommended 2 items that are relevant to this discussion. One is that the town begin to regulate lot coverage, right? So that you can't cover 100% of the lot with impervious surface. So we introduced that as a recommendation. Second, we introduced a recommendation that you have a porous, pervious, or permeable pavement incentive that allows someone a little more flexibility with the lot coverage, a marginally higher increase in lot coverage if a corresponding area is provided in one of those forms of pavement. So we've got a couple of recommendations that came from earlier work that are potentially informative to what we're doing now, assuming those were to move forward in some form.
I think we
All
can
right.
come back to this,
Okay.
Francesco. I think you're going to have to move on here.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and that's a bigger topic because I could talk about that for a long time.
Okay, this is the second part of this, just basic tree requirements, how islands should be constructed, et cetera. Just a little language that should be adjusted here. I don't think there's that much to discuss there. Tree planting requirements. Do people feel that your tree planting requirements for parking areas are working? Too much, too little?
I think that's a very broad question. I don't know how you answer it.
Yeah, well,
we get.
What are you
we get
looking for?
robust-
Yes or no?
Yeah,
We
so
get robust landscaping plans with every
Yeah.
application we get. So I think there's an opportunity for the commission to weigh in on landscaping on really every project, and we do.
Okay. What I'm trying to understand is whether or not you feel the requirements are too onerous and it's impossible for applicants to meet and you're constantly waiving these requirements, or if you feel like you don't have enough teeth to require more landscaping, more trees in parking lots. So that is the general direction I was looking for.
I think we get robust landscaping plans. Robust.
Yeah. Lynn?
Yeah, I would agree. No one has ever, that I can remember, asked for a reduction in the landscaping other than like a side buffer, which we never give. So,
Okay. All right. So we're good here then. Very good. Thank you. Frontage strip landscaping, I think those comments likely apply to this. And Lynn, I think this is part of what you're talking about, is reducing some of this width in some cases. So what this section does is it requires a buffer along all sides of a parking lot, front, sides, and rear, and that can vary depending on the size of the parking lot, and it allows for various types of treatments: landscaping, fences, walls, berms, etc. Right. So you feel like this is working okay?
This is Lynn speaking. I feel like we need to do a better job with the front strips. We have some great examples. I think the Big Y is a great example. But then we have, some examples that probably aren't as good, especially around large multifamily or developments, residential developments. And now that I'm saying all this, I wonder if they're all the subsidized housing developments where we really don't have any control anyways. So, but if we were to get there, we would want better strips in the front.
Okay, so front, that's the one area of deficiency that you see, front strips.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would tend to agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
Me too.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right, section 13.8.6, parking lot buffers. These are a little more detail here on other aspects of the buffer and what's required. And that varies, this varies per zone with different widths depending on the zone and depending on the adjacent land use. And this is kind of connected to, yeah, buffer requirements for many of your uses spanning many of your districts. And that's one of the next items that we need to explore are your screening and buffer requirements. And I think we do a much better job of regulating those in a more consistent and standardized way. It's a little spotty right now. So maybe what we could do is we could defer this item to when we address buffer and screening requirements as a whole and treat it holistically. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It does. It does. And I definitely think it needs some attention. And I think
Okay.
Lynn would agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that I think it's around the TC 80 zone, right off the highway. You know, that's the first thing people see when they come off, you know, major exit coming into the town. And, you know, I think we need some greenery there. I think
Okay.
in all of these, I would even go back to some of the parking lot things. You know, when on this slide, when you broke it down to zones, that's what popped into my head. But we need to do something in that area.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as you could probably see in the commercial and industrial districts, between commercial and industrial uses, you have a zero requirement for any sort of buffering.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay. Very well. All right, parking lot. We talked about drainage already, and you have a curb requirement. We just want to make sure that this doesn't suggest that you have to have curbs everywhere, which would preclude, drainage swales and rain gardens and that sort of thing. So we need to fix that to exempt those applications. Downtown Pawcatuck Overlay District. So this would be of interest to Sal, and he's probably most likely familiar with it. This overlay district, let me jump ahead a slide to show you what we're talking about, the area we're talking about. So the candy stripe here is the PV5 district. The black outline is the parking district overlay boundary. So it doesn't cover the entire PV5. It just covers this area surrounding Route 1 and Route 2 cutting through it. And there's the aerial of it. So what this regulation does, this overlay district does, is it provides relief from your parking requirements in that area. So it eliminates parking requirements for most existing uses within the district. You have zero parking requirement. It also allows a reduction in parking for uses that are required to provide off-street parking. So if you are required, you do have to provide some, but it can be reduced. And it encourages shared parking and loading. But Sal, do you want to talk a little bit about how effective this is in the PV5, if this does in fact do what it's intended to do, or give us some insight if you have any?
So I'm trying to look at your slide here and trying to blow it up. Let's see here.
So basically what it says is that 9.4.2, minimum parking and loading requirements do not apply for existing commercial buildings in the overlay district. So if you have an existing commercial building and you have a use or a change of use, you don't have to provide more parking. The commission may require on-site parking or loading where it deems that the uses proposed will have a negative impact. So you reserve the right to require it, even though you say that it's not required. The uses that don't qualify.
Are we actually lowering the parking requirements as residential units above a commercial space or near a commercial space?
Yeah, that's the next part of it. 9.4.3, non-qualified uses. Minimum on-site parking requirements must be met for the following uses unless a reduction is granted by the commission by a special use permit. And that includes new commercial, so any new construction, new commercial, institutional, or mixed-use construction, or additions to existing buildings that increase the gross floor area by more than 10%, and all residential uses in the overlay district. So in any of those conditions, you have to provide parking, but the commission can reduce that parking requirement. Okay.
So I'm looking at section B of 9.4.3.
Yeah.
So if you're adding in additional residential units to commercial building, you're saying that the commission can actually relax the parking requirements.
Yes,
Okay.
you are required to provide parking as is required by the regs, but the commission may relax.
Okay. Is there a criteria for the commission?
No, it just says unless a reduction is granted by the commission by special use permit. So I think what we have to do is we have to then interpret, and this is interpretation, we have to interpret that reduction is provided through one of the other mechanisms that we reviewed. Off-site parking, shared use parking, whatever it may be. That is the mechanism by which you allow the reduction, and then it may be granted.
I actually think that there should be like an overlay for a specific area of downtown that has PB5 that we're trying to build up.
Is this the area? Because this is
where
the
the
overlay.
Amtrak bridge is, going over to, Rhode Island, that specific area is going to have a real hard time, renovating any of those buildings and complying with the mandates for, well, not the mandates, but the reason why we changed into PV5 was we wanted to have more commercial downstairs. And we've learned that, we want the residential upstairs as well, so that we kind of have this, more densely populated area that is going to frequent, all the establishments down there. And I think that's going to be very hard to do unless we actually relax some of the regs within PB5 for parking in that area. So
Sal,
I don't think that this actually does enough.
Are you seeing the map and the overlay?
I am.
And that black line. So this is the overlay. This is where within this area, you don't require existing buildings to provide new parking when they have a turnover in use, change of use, whatever. But you still require it for new construction, additions to buildings, and residential. Is this area the right area that this needs to be applied to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing Cogswell Street. I'm seeing to Noyes Ave there.
Yeah.
Right there. I think it should be more concentrated, to, even if we went out to where PB5 is, where Dairy Queen is, that should really be the area, going into downtown and the actual downtown,
to the
south, corner of
then?
Mechanic Street and that should actually have that relaxed, parking requirement. Because those buildings, short of tearing them down and building in parking, we're not going to be able to resurrect that area.
Okay.
Francisco, this is Jim Lathrop. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I've been watching it. A little difficulty getting on in the early part of the discussion tonight. It's my feeling, and again, I spend a good portion of my life down here, that the parking overlay district, as it pertains to commercial uses and changes of use and all the things you've been talking about, is very effective. To give you an example, one of the great successes of downtown Pawcatuck has been Hoof's Restaurant, which has very limited parking, but it's been a phenomenal success. It's brought up the Pawcatuck Bridge area. They've done a phenomenal job with the business. But for this overlay district, I don't believe it could exist from a zoning regulatory standpoint. So it's because they simply don't have they couldn't meet the parking, and the people that dine there park everywhere. But in accordance with some of Chuck's comments earlier and some of the other people that have been just talking tonight, it is a little bit a time shift. They're busy at night, the businesses leave during the day. There's really no conflict that I've he has I think there may be parking agreements between that business and other local businesses that I'm not privy to, but I mean, it works. We figure it out. The private sector figures it out down there. But I will say again, as someone who spends time down there and owns property down there, but the ability to develop some of the other properties there is very limited by parking. So looking down the road, right now, PV5 is 1-to-1 in terms of residential units to parking space requirements generally, if you meet the bonus density requirements, which most of the buildings can meet. I would argue that this is one of the places in Stonington that you do not need a car to live. It's a much shorter distance walking to the Westerly train station than it is to walking to the Mystic train station from downtown, from let's say Mystic River Bridge. You have a huge amount of personal services and everything really need to live, including a grocery store, which again is in walking distance. It's on the Rhode Island side. But that's one of the things residents need to drive to if you can't walk to it. I see people walking from McQuaid's every day to go to their downtown apartments. So I would encourage the commission to open their minds a little bit to further relaxing the parking regulations on residential down here, because this is one of the places that you can live in Stonington without a car, or at least some of the residents here may opt to do so. And if the person maybe just wants to use a car on a weekend or keeps it at their parents' house or whatever, outside of the area, or chooses to Uber places. These are all things that are a little bit new, a little bit urban. And this part of Stonington, very different from Mystic, where the first part of tonight seemed to be the focus. So please don't think of regulating downtown Pawcatuck the same way as downtown Mystic is regulated, because the problems and challenges are different.
Right.
But those are my thoughts on that.
Okay.
Jim, thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Okay.
From my office in Pawcatuck, I mean, we see people on the regular walking with bags, coming from Stop and Shop, going into downtown. So, it traverses up Liberty Street where, people are actually walking and, making use of, not having a vehicle. And I think we really want to promote that.
Okay. So I'm hearing people strongly in favor of preserving these regulations, this overlay district, and potentially expanding it, whether geographically to the south or even making it providing a little more definitive relief for other types of uses such as residential or new construction. Is that correct?
I think you have to couch into this things like, well, is there really on-street parking on Mechanic Street? Not really. Is it within PV5? Yes.
Okay.
So you have to look a little bit about the width of the roads and things of that nature. I think the overlay district could be tweaked a little bit, but it's pretty close.
Okay. All right. So if there's any
We
work
got to
to be
keep
done on
moving.
this,
We got to
it'll be
keep
some
moving here,
minor.
Francesca.
Well aware. Thank you. I just want to afford everyone an opportunity to speak.
No, understand.
Okay.
We probably, looking backwards, we probably could have spent less time reviewing the recommendations from the last session, move through that more quickly, just in future sessions. We spent a half an hour reviewing our recommendations. I think that's helpful, but we should have gotten to this part of the discussion sooner, in my opinion. Very important stuff.
Understood. Okay. I want to talk about section 6.3.10. That is the section that identifies the permit requirements for a parking lot. If you're over a certain threshold, you need a special use permit, is basically what it comes down to. 20 or more vehicles, you need a special use permit. Now, we talked about this at length now 2 years ago, probably. And we made some adjustments to the wording because it was unclear as to how it was to be treated. And what we arrived at is this, and it essentially that if you're 20 or more, you need a special use permit. However, if you expand your parking lot by less than 20 spaces, you don't need a special use permit. Once you expand by 20 or more spaces, that's the trigger. That's the threshold for a special use permit. That's what we arrived at. However, we received a letter from a concerned resident who saw this as a loophole and was concerned about someone incrementally expanding a parking lot, like 19 or fewer spaces at a time, and then never having to pull a special use permit and building out a large parking lot. So I realize that's a real concern. I think we talked about that as a potential concern originally, and we didn't think that was likely to happen. But so I've made some recommendations, and one of the focuses here is really just to clean up the language, to tighten it up, to make it more clear. The other part of it in question is whether or not we just outright require any parking lot more than 20 spaces to require a special use permit in any condition, right? So regardless of whether or not you're expanding, if you're more than 20 spaces, whatever you're adding requires a special use permit. So presumably, if someone already has a special use permit in place, they would have to come in and modify that permit and go through another public hearing, or then pull a special use permit. And so the way we do that is we just get rid of item E, and then the rest of this language would carry it.
I like that suggestion.
I think that's
So do I.
Right? It's just more straightforward, less ambiguous, and no loophole.
And I think 20 vehicles, is the right number. Anything more than that in a small town like this, as congested as some of the portions of this town are, that's the right metric.
The next question I have for you all is a special use permit, is that the right requirement? Could there be another step in this process by which you require a site plan application instead of a special use permit?
No, special use permit.
Yeah,
That's my opinion. I
Okay.
think
mine as well.
Very
But
intense.
if there's more than 20 parking spaces, they have to have landscaping and everything, right?
Correct.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we have to review that.
Well, yeah, but if they are required to have a special use permit, a site plan requirement is part of that implicitly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The question is whether or not you could strip out the special use permit and just require a site plan application.
Oh, no. Okay. I think we go through the whole special use permit. Yep.
All right. Good. I have the direction I need. Thank you. Okay. So I do have several more slides to go, but we don't need to review each of them in detail. What I want to do is orient you with what the content is, and it's all here in the slideshow that's been shared with you. And then what I really need you to do is take a look at these numbers and these requirements, and at our next meeting, let me know if they make sense to you and if you want to proceed with the approach that we're taking. So let me introduce you to why we're doing what we're doing. 45 of 77 of your principal uses do not have a specified parking requirement. So in those cases, in those 45 cases, only 32 have an identified requirement. It's incumbent upon the Planning and Zoning Commission to determine the parking required. And per section 13.3.1, it says that you should reference ITE's Parking Generation Manual 5th edition or more recent edition. Does the commission have access to this manual, and have you used this manual in determining the appropriate amount of parking required?
We definitely have used ITE
Okay.
before, not extensively.
All right. Have you required the applicant to reference ITE and then come in with that homework, or do you as a commission actually go into the guidance manual and pull numbers and then arrive
No,
at?
it's generally done by the applicant's traffic engineer.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so let's take a look at all of the uses. So all of these uses none of these uses have a specified parking requirement. It's a big list. Now, some of these are really complex uses that you don't see very often. And so it's really not an issue that you need to have a traffic study, you need to reference the manual, and you need to figure out what the requirement should be. And that might be like a school or some marine facilities that are real nuanced uses. But many of these, whether like a bed and breakfast, a bank, a billiard parlor, all those are fairly standard uses in a bank, a bed and breakfast. You see those type of applications more frequently, a health club. And you should have a standard established for those. It should be standardized. So what we've done is we've prepared tables that build out standards for many, not all, but many of those. We still leave a number of the more complex and nuanced ones to your discretion, as you've been doing. But our goal in building this table is to specify the parking requirement for as many uses as feasible. Second is to shift from head and seat counts to gross floor area based standards. Third is to standardize the units of measure by increments of 1,000 square feet, and the symbol we use for that is KSF. Fourth is to maintain your existing requirements as feasible. So we're not trying to take things in one direction or another. We're not trying to increase requirements. We're not trying to reduce them. We're just trying to translate them into a more reliable standard. And fifth is to maintain commission discretion for complex and unique uses. All right. So these are the tables they're all in the slides, and we have the recommended minimum standard and the existing minimum standard side by side. You can see a lot of these uses. There's no standard specified, and to the greatest extent possible, we've moved to a gross floor area standard. These standards are based upon ITE's traffic generation manual and work that we've done in many communities to date, and we've refined those standards. We've adjusted them to a suburban community. There are different types of generation depending whether you're urban, rural, suburban. These are all adjusted to a suburban type community. So what I'd like you to do between now and the next meeting is to review these, come back with any questions or concerns you may have. And ultimately, I think it's my goal to move this table forward as potentially as your new parking requirement standards and tables to replace your existing tables. Okay?
Okay, that's everybody's homework.
Okay.
All right. And so this now covers all of your uses. Every single use that's in the principal use table is identified here in more or less in the same order as well. So this table should look real familiar to you. All these uses are defined in the zoning regulations. They're all on the table. So all these terms should look very familiar, and it should be very clear to you exactly what these things are. Okay, so our next steps is to continue our our work in this work phase, which includes site design, buffer requirements, parking, and signage. So I have a lot of follow-up work to do on parking. We need to next move on to other aspects, and I think it probably makes sense to move on to your buffer requirements and landscaping and screening requirements work, since it's a good segue. And so that will be the focus of our next meeting, will be to continue our conversation on parking and then move towards a discussion on buffer and screening and landscaping requirements. All right. And then at the meeting after that, we'll focus on signage. Does that sound like a good approach?
Yeah, I think it's a good segue from what we discussed today.
Okay, very good. So our next meeting is scheduled for February 26th, and once again at 6 p.m.
Works for me.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Appreciate everyone.
for me.
I just want to say before we close out here, and I know you've got a few more comments, Francesco, that I particularly appreciate everybody from the board and a lot of our stakeholders that are on board tonight too, taking the time to come to 2 meetings this week. You know, it is a big slice of time out of everybody's life, and I do appreciate that. And thank you for being present tonight. That goes for both commission members and some of the loyal stakeholders that have followed this every week. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, bye.